Are you currently dealing with anxiety or feelings of shame and guilt? On this episode, we're speaking with Dr. Jonathan Fisher. He's a Harvard-trained cardiologist who combines his Western medical training with Eastern philosophies to help people heal their hearts, both physically and emotionally.
In this episode, you're going to learn three things at least. Number one is the mindset that Dr. Fisher used to overcome his anxiety. Number two is the importance and the role of courage in the health of the heart. And number three, good old-fashioned compassion, the techniques and the importance of it. Let's take a listen together.
Jonathan, I really appreciate and love this beautiful combination that you have of being a Harvard-trained cardiologist, according to the Western paradigm, who has now approached the treatment of the heart and the healing of the heart from a more holistic perspective that includes empathy and vulnerability and courage. I'm so curious to hear about your journey and how that has led you to where you're at now. What is one aspect of your childhood that you had previously perceived as quote unquote bad or not good that you now perceive as a blessing?
Wow, great question. I see myself sitting in the corner at a typical party in suburban New Jersey where teenagers are doing teenage things. And I was observing. I was on the sidelines. And I had thoughts and worries and fears and anxieties. And it was all about I, me. What are they thinking about me? And all of the judgments I had for myself. And that really was, at the time, extremely unpleasant. To live inside that brain, it felt like a prison of sorts. And there was very little space, very little freedom and openness, and certainly lots of fear and very little courage there. I tended to stay on the sidelines. I was comfortable as an observer. And to answer your question, if I look back now, it was that tendency to be an observer, which has allowed me to take perspectives which are not traditional, but also are able to bring together disparate points of view. East, West, medical, scientific, spiritual, theoretical, emotional. And I would say that your phrasing of the question is such a powerful one to allow me to reframe in a way. Parts of me that are still there. That child is still there with us. He's on the couch watching us, but he's not so neurotic anymore.
I love that. And I can relate very, very much. I too was someone who growing up dealt with a lot of anxiety and hypervigilant. And that vigilance has become a blessing for me in many ways. So at what point did this shift start to happen where you got some distance from the anxiety and you realized, okay, this is not a normal way of being. Let me do something different about it. I'm curious to learn about another way. When did that come?
It came with the help of Phil, was my first therapist. And Phil is someone who I was only able to muster up the courage because my sister kicked me through the door of his office. I was so afraid. I was so afraid of someone else looking inside of me, what they might find. I felt like I had so many secrets and so much shame about this inner world that had just been mine for 25 years. And this happened late in my life. It happened after college, after medical school. It happened during my medicine residency when I was at Harvard, going through the motions of becoming a young doctor and facing death and feeling responsible for it. And it was my sister who encouraged me to get help from what was more than anxiety, what was depression and isolation and lots of rumination and patterns that were keeping me away from other people, even as I was choosing to be a healer of sorts, to be a cardiologist. The irony is still remarkable. I have to laugh at it. And so I have to give credit, Ben, to Phil, who was my therapist. And the very first time we sat down, he could see that I was afraid. I was afraid to even open my mouth for what I might discover about myself. And he helped me see that fear was unfounded. And he helped me appreciate the freedom that comes. It came for me, at least, by opening up to the scary parts then sharing with me that I was certainly not alone, that he could share from his experience that so many others had gone through what I had gone through. So that was the very first stage. And then that prepared me to dive, deep over the next 20 years. And I can't say that I'm finished, Ben. We're here together. This conversation is also part of the transition process. I view my life as every moment as a potential to help us grow together. There wasn't one moment, but that was the beginning of a beautiful process of where I stumbled along the way.
It's an endless unfolding. And I'm curious, so right now, you've been on this journey of unfolding over the last 20 years, and you talk about these 7 principles to embody to have a healthy heart. Which one would you say is most challenging for you right now?
I'm going through them all in my head right now because depending on the chapter of my life, each one is challenging me and each one is calling me to strengthen it again and over and over. I would say in the past chapters, the one of the 7 that I needed the most help with was courage. Ultimately, they all lead towards the final trait of the heart, which is warmth. The ultimate trait is warmth, which is a composite of empathy, compassion, and love, and that encompasses altruism, generosity, etc. And yet, the pathway to opening the heart fully again and again towards warmth requires courage along the way. And I was, as I said, deeply anxious, deeply fearful, and I had ingrained these patterns of thinking and responding so deeply over and over, I didn't want to let them go, and they still come up. In my life, I would say, the arc of my life has been one towards courage as a stepping stone to more sustained warmth of my heart. Thinking about it differently, I'm in a transitional phase in my life where the first half of my life was dedicated to science and technical prowess and expertise and mastery of the body and the physical heart. And I'm excited now. This is a new phase. The trait of the heart that I would have to call on to experience this transition in its fullness would be openness, the trait of having an open heart. So I suppose that your question is helping me in a way because I'm trying to figure out where is this life leading me. It's that balance between our intentions and dreams for our own life and then the plans that the world has for us. I'm trying to meet that with openness right now, Ben.
I appreciate that. And I sense your openness right now. Thank you for your openness and your vulnerability. Mitra, I know you have all sorts of questions.
Yeah, first of all, I want to just let everybody know that I met Jonathan on an audio platform during COVID. And I remember the first time I was in a so-called room listening, and I just realized that, oh my God, I want to get to know this human being. And I remember, Jonathan, you didn't even say much, but it was the energy and the words and then the energy of the words. And I was just so interested to know and to know you, to know what you believe, how you practice. So I just wanted to put that out there because I have stayed curious. I have followed you. We connect on different platforms. You've written a book since then. I just would love to learn more about it on this as we're interviewing, but I'm sure it will come naturally. But my question was, because you spoke about courage a lot, the courage of coming out, taking the first step, being open. I want to go back to where Ben started as a child, because I don't know, maybe it's my belief that we have it inherently and then we take it away or they take it away. The institutionalized life takes it away. Do you remember when you were really courageous?
As a child?
Yeah.
I do. I was 5 years old. My parents would take me to the synagogue on Friday nights for the Sabbath, and they would be sitting there with all the other older people, 150 people in the chairs and saying the prayers, and I would explore without hesitation. I was so small that I could crawl underneath the chairs and the aisles, and I would look down, and I could see 150 feet and legs, all the shoes and socks and just the pant legs, and that's all I could see. And I didn't hold back. I would crawl around, I would pull at people's pants and wave hello to them. I would explore. And there was a sense of adventure, of exploration. There was no burden of the interior world. It was all about exploration, curiosity, and really connection and curiosity. So that really captures how I was as a small child, I would say, age 5 through 7.
And fun. I heard fun there too. Just that's pure fun. Okay. Then my next question coming from your explanation is, how do you pull pants and crawl underneath places right now as an adult?
It begins with noticing every time I have an opportunity to try something new or to reach for something, and noticing my instinct after I was a child was to start to say no and make up all the reasons why I couldn't go to a party or couldn't be on an interview or speak on a stage or share my crazy ideas with one person, let alone now a billion people with the book. So the way that I'm pulling at the pant cuffs now is, and the way that I'm exploring that is just every time I think about where life can go, I notice the blocks and limitations that instantly come up as part of an old default pattern in my mind. Mm-hmm. And I just notice them, I honor them, and I brush them aside. I say, what if there were no limits? What if no one told me, no, that's not okay? Mm-hmm. And what if I realized that all the rules that we have decided by humans? And what if I explored life as if we get to make the rules as we go?
Wow, I love that. I just have another question because I love the energy with which you explained. How do you have fun these days? What is your fun thing that you do as an adult, as a physician, as a cardiologist, a father, husband, all those things?
Oh, some of it is mundane. I have fun when I drive my children to school and to the bus stop every morning. I have a 16-year-old son who, believe it or not, still wants to be with his mom and dad as much as anyone else. And if I drink from a coffee cup, I notice the next day he's taking my cup. Darn it. And with my daughter, who's 13 years old, and really there's a lot of silliness in the car. There's a lot of silliness. I try to embarrass them when I drop them off at school. And some of this is because I know that's what they need from me right now. They don't need the lectures, and there's no shortage of lectures coming from me. Don't get me wrong. So the fun comes out there. The fun also comes out in the gym. There was a time when I practiced triathlon, and so just growing into a new sport, pushing myself beyond limits. And now that I'm in my 50s, trying to put my body into a shape that it hasn't been in for a little while. So I find that fun, pushing the boundaries there. I would say the most fun that I have is when I show up in an open way in facilitating groups of executives, doctors, nurses, which is part of my job. It's part of what I do in a large healthcare system. And it's strange to think of it as fun, but I can tell you, I'm just remembering now, I was asked to lead a workshop for the executive suite of our healthcare system. We have 40,000 employees, and there were 9 executives over, and they didn't know what they were in for. One of them knew that I was some kind of a mindfulness, meditation. They didn't know. And I went in there and I really made it up. And the first thing I did, I asked the CEO, can you please take off your shoes right now? He looked at me like, what are you doing? This is supposed to be a mental fitness workshop. So I had everyone take their shoes off to feel the ground, to get connected with their bodies. And so for me, there's a bit of mischievousness that I can take out in these places and help other people see the artificial boundaries that are keeping us from fun.
We talk about having fun as something that we do, but in my experience, as I've opened up more, having fun is just a way of, it's our nature. It's a way of being. Being anything I do can be joyous. Anything, that energy of joy, that energy of spontaneity is within me. And anything I do, whether in this conversation or whether I'm walking my dog or having a business meeting, can be imbued with that energy of fun. And I think this is what we forget, is that being in a joyous state is not something that we do. It's what we are. And we just have to remove the blocks, which is what you teach in your book, right? It's really a process of removing through courage. Courage, I think, is the key ingredient. Yeah. Removing the blocks that we have. So that natural joy, that natural love, the warmth. Warmth is not something that we do. It's what we are. Being kind is what we are, and loving. And not only is it what we are, I can't help but to be that way. That's what's emanating from me, from my heart, because I have more access to it. It's more open.
I love that, Ben. I think about it very similarly. I do think that removing the obstacles that are there, which by itself reminds us that we all have these innate resources, these innate qualities, these innate traits of the heart, which are covered over time. And this is an Eastern philosophical concept, that we have this spark within us. And it's also a dynamic process. It doesn't happen once where we remove the barriers of our heart. They come up again and again. So it's a constant process. I do think that there is, with all of these traits, both a trait and a state for each one. These qualities, whether we're talking about steadiness. Steadiness can be a practice of breathing or grounding of the body when we're feeling anxious, or it can be a general approach to life, which is equanimity and calm and meeting challenges without over or underreacting, losing our balance. I do think it's both a way of being, and I also think that there's another way in, which is simply by doing, we can then go into the being.
Yes, we have to do the doing. And in my experience, I've had to do the doing to get to the being. And in your book, you mentioned something I think is really important, and you alluded to it here, which is step one is to stabilize. If our nervous system is dysregulated, if our body is in a fight-flight state, step one is to stabilize, is to regulate the nervous system. Yeah, that was key to my journey. And I'm curious, what have you used in your experience? What was the key? Because you explained that you were in a period where you were dealing with a lot of anxiety. You were dysregulated. Did you have any particular tools that you used that resonated most with you?
There were the tools that helped me at the beginning, and then there are the tools that I go to most often now, after 15 years or so of practice. And at the beginning, the tool was mindfulness. The practice was, on the one hand, mindfulness, which offered me a new approach to facing any moment of stress, which was of getting out of my head and getting into my body and shifting my state from one of judgment and fear to one of curiosity and potential and learning.
Curiosity. Yeah, curiosity is
So mindfulness was really a big part of that. And at the same time, I realized that my anxiety existed in my mind and the body. And so I needed a practice for the body as well to work through and to become aware of where I was holding stress and anxiety. And for me, that was yoga, and it continues to be yoga practice, and occasionally Tai Chi and Qigong. Really, any kind of body movement that's practiced in a mindful, intentional way can serve as that bookend for the practices of the mind, which involve a mindful stance, cognitive reframing practices, and taking a stoic approach to the ups and downs of life.
Yeah, I think that paradigm shift is so key, right? Is moving into curiosity about what I'm experiencing, what is happening. So what have you learned about why the body responds the way it does? Another way to frame this is, how has learning about the heart for you allowed you to have more compassion towards your anxiety?
Part of the answer comes from not only studying the heart theoretically, but working with patients and listening to their hearts, examining their hearts, watching their hearts, holding their hearts, and seeing the universal qualities of the heart, which by itself strengthened my own empathy for myself. If I started to notice that all of my patients, or many of them, were responding in the same way to a news report of a fire or devastation somewhere, and their blood pressure was going up, for example, and their average resting heart rate was going up by 5 points day after day in the clinic after some global disaster, there is this sense of connection and this sense that what's happening inside my body is really not unique at all. And I'm not as special as I thought, even in my anxiety. And so that's one way. Working with other people's hearts has strengthened my empathy for my own. The other is recognizing that the activities of the heart, and by which I mean emotions, but also the pumping, beating action and the pressure that builds up, the electrical activity of the heart, is inseparable from the activities of the mind in any moment. Yeah. And by activities of the mind, I'm referring to our thoughts, our feelings, our interpretations, judgments, predictions, memories. As my practice evolved in medicine, and my interest in this field of psychocardiology, which is the connection between our physical, emotional, social, and spiritual heart dimensions, emerged, it gave me more of a sense that there was nothing wrong with me all along when I would feel my heart ache when I was nervous. And I started to understand the actual mechanisms by which that happens.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah. There was a time in my life when I thought that my whole life would be filled with fear because it was like that was the only way that I knew. And it made me a good doctor, by the way. Knowing what could potentially go wrong is a good quality for a heart doctor because I'm already thinking about 10 different things so that you don't have to experience them so we can protect the heart. But when it comes to my own experience, it's not so pleasant. And because of this practice, these practices, mindfulness, yoga, awareness of fear in my body as it arises, ability to cognitive reframe thoughts and interpretations as they happen, ability to ask for help and support for others when I'm feeling fear, my experience of fear is really diminished compared with a decade ago.
Yeah. I'm curious what your experience and relationship is with guilt. It seems to be something that so many people deal with, and I perceive as one of the biggest blocks to accessing our hearts. And guilt can manifest in so many different ways, from small day-to-day things like I forgot to lock the door and I feel guilty about that. Like I feel bad that I did that, or I said the wrong thing and I feel guilty about saying the quote-unquote wrong thing to someone. Or bigger things where I did something that I'm not super proud about in a relationship with someone and I feel guilty about that. It just seems to be an emotion that is such a barrier for people to be able to access their hearts. What are your perspectives on that?
Guilt is a blockage for achieving real health when we live with guilt that's unresolved. So that's the reason I care about guilt, not only because it's unpleasant when I'm experiencing it and I need to know how to work with it, but I also, the whole subject of my book is how these emotions affect our physical hearts and our physical health and how I can help other people work with these feelings and emotions. Stepping back, I think it's important to distinguish guilt from shame. And I also think it's important to recognize the value in guilt as the value in any emotion. From an evolutionary psychological standpoint, guilt is extremely important. It helps us as a tribe, as a community, regulate ourselves. It helps us check our behavior against the norms of our group. If the group has even established norms, or if everyone is violating the norms, there is no more guilt. And we're all running towards the bottom of the moral ladder. So I really value guilt. And as a father with 3 teenage children, I don't try to take guilt away from my children when they transgress or when they're behaving in a way that is inappropriate. And there's a very big difference between momentary guilt and learning to use that as an indication of where we've veered from our higher values and from the community standards of behavior. There's a difference between that and shame, which is a more broad covering over of ourselves, embarrassment because of our behavior. And it tends to be a generalized critique of our whole self. So we bleed from one small behavior into, I am a shameful person. And this comes up so often in healthcare, where we may make a mistake and we may feel guilty about it, and then we feel ashamed. And when we carry that shame with us, it affects all of our behaviors in negative ways. This leads into a whole nother conversation, which is about forgiveness. And so often we ignore this practice of forgiveness, and we don't even realize that we can forgive ourselves. In fact, many people are afraid. I was afraid to forgive myself of all the things that I thought that I had done wrong or had done wrong, for fear that I would let go of the one thing that was keeping me on the right path. And we now know from the research on self-compassion, that's wrong. Psychologically, shame is a very bad way to help people behave in healthy ways. Forgiveness and self-compassion have been a big part of my practice, and it's what I teach my patients.
I love what you said, Jonathan. Guilt as an information or guilt as a state of being where we park ourselves and really vibrate from that space. I really love that distinction. Where was the last time you used guilt as information?
Oh, it must have come up at home with my wife, not having done, let's say, clean the dishes. And she had politely asked that I do something. And the next day it became clear I hadn't done it. And I was reminded of it and I felt guilty. And I didn't want to dismiss the guilt because I needed some way to change my behavior for the sake of our marriage and our relationship. And guilt isn't a bad thing. And yet at the same time, a while back, I recognized that I was carrying much more shame than guilt. And it was leading to more explosive arguments than needed to happen. So that anytime we would have what might be a conversation or a disagreement, I would turn it into a full-blown explosion because I was carrying my own shame and guilt and defensiveness because of that.
Yep.
So as I did my own work of self-compassion and working through guilt, embarrassment, and shame, and replacing that with self-empathy, self-compassion, and self-love, I was able to be a better partner for my wife and father for my children.
Wow. That's really very practical and deep answer. I want to ask Ben, when did you last? I'm honestly trying to find out for myself too, so don't think I'm not asking myself.
I'm going to come right back at you. So bring it on.
Laurie, aren't expecting that. I know we all get naked in a sense in this platform. So tell me, do you have anything to say, Ben, about that?
I resonate deeply with what you've shared. Self-compassion has been a very key component to my own personal journey. And it's a process. It's a layered process. At first, it's hard. It's really hard. And self-compassion can manifest in so many different ways. For me, it's really interesting. Physical touch, touching myself, like my chest, or caressing my head in a gentle and compassionate way, has had profound impacts on me and allowed me to move into self-compassion. And I don't understand it. It's really weird. It's like some sort of switch goes off when I feel the touch, a gentle touch of my hand over my head and over my ears and my neck, just calm down. And I'm able to tap in to self-love easier that way. And a big part of my process as well has been, we talked about this a little bit, Jonathan, the paradigm shift, understanding that all the quote unquote flaws that I have were all ways for me to survive when I was a child and I didn't know any better. And seeing that and really understanding that, yeah, that little child, little Ben, didn't know any better. And instead of chastising me or chastising him for being anxious or for being impulsive with something, I understand. I get it. I know why you were that way. And I love you. I understand. So that's been a big part of my journey.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
It's similar to the practice that I had. So once I recognized that my own need for tenderness and for affection, because it hadn't been there as a child, I then started to practice it like you were saying with the caress, which it's interesting. There are several reasons why when we caress ourselves, we feel more calm and we're more open to others. And some of it is the mammalian oxytocin release between mother and child. So in a sense, that connects with the second part of what you were saying, which is you were giving yourself the affection to that small child that maybe he needed at the time, almost a mother would to a child. And perhaps your mother maybe in that moment wasn't there. And so part of my own process is to mother myself, to parent myself again. And I learned this from a teacher back in 2012 when I started getting into visualization techniques and Buddhist practices and combining that with Western psychological practices, this whole idea of reparenting ourselves in the idealized way that we never had and realizing that we have the potential to give ourselves what we need. We have that capacity. And it also reminds me of the Tibetan practice of Tonglen. When I'm experiencing suffering, rather than doing the natural thing, which is to fight it and to curse it, what if I were instead at that moment to breathe in everyone else's suffering? You'd think that would be cruel because we can't bear it. What we find is that we can breathe in the suffering of others and we can transform that in our hearts and breathe out compassion towards others. It taught me that we have such power in our hearts to be mothers to ourselves, to be fathers to ourselves and to each other in a way. And that flexibility in relationship has helped me with my patients. Thousands of patients means thousands of walks of life, rich and poor and sick and healthy, and also working in workshops and facilitating in groups. You never know who's in the room. And so one moment you have to be a friend, the next moment you have to be a father, and then you have to be a mother. And so the more that I'm able to embrace the yin and the yang, the feminine and the masculine, I think the better I can be a mirror and a servant to those that I'm helping.
Thank you.
That was very profound. I just wanted something that came up when Ben was explaining. Something came up for me that is fundamental to actually parenting ourselves or others. And that distinction between liking and loving, because we use these two words interchangeably. And I always told my kids I love them no matter what. But there was times, either for myself or for them, that I didn't like what it was done or being done. And distinction between these two allows redemption, if you like, or growth, if you like, depending on from which perspective you look at it. I remember a scene comes to me that my daughter had done something extremely difficult and not acceptable. And I was holding her feet. This was in Toronto, so it was really cold. Her feet were cold, and I was kissing her feet, telling her how much I dislike what she has done and what are the consequences. Of course, it sounds like I was an ideal mother. I wasn't. Part of my guilt is around that. And I didn't even have the vocabulary then. I was 30 years old. I don't even remember these functions, but I remembered that I was able to do that. I was doing that instinctively, that this is how I do it, because it was so extreme and I really wanted to tell her off. But I also didn't want her to feel that I don't love her anymore. I just didn't really like what she had done.
Yeah. That's such an important distinction. And I think that's what so many parents struggle with. And that's what so many children end up struggling with, right? The perception as a child, if the parent isn't clear about making sure that the love is still present while also communicating what you did, I don't like. If that's not there, then the child can easily confuse the situation as mom doesn't love me because I did this thing, or dad doesn't. And as we all know, that leads to all sorts of challenges in our adult lives and adult relationships.
This is such an interesting part of the conversation. It makes me think of all the people that I've met who don't have a basis to have experienced unconditional love. What if someone never had that? So then has to learn to be a parent and to provide something that they never experienced. It's a challenge. It's a challenge.
Yes.
We look for examples elsewhere, I would suppose.
Yeah.
Self-parenting is so important, Jonathan, as you were talking about it. I quite often forget that. Even when I master it with my children and those who consider themselves my children, because I have this motherly character, but I forget to give it to myself. I often become a very admonishing parent to myself. And to me, that is the most difficult thing. It's so much easier, especially, of course, and now I'm older and I'm looking at my parenting in a completely differently. I'm no longer in survival mode. I'm no longer the immigrant mother who had to do everything, be the father, be the mother, and work and be there and take them to school and to classes. But so I'm more in thriving mode. It's much easier. I hold my students and clients easily with that beautiful unconditional love, no problem. And then I come to myself at night and I see, oh my God, the stick is in my hand again. I'm just really shaking it. And I think, what happened to that loving person who could almost take everything in and hold the space still lovingly? She just disappears in no time.
So what do you do when that happens?
Drop into my mother energy for somebody else. It's just like the practice that whoever is easier. So who can I have that love for if they had done what I had done in that moment? And immediately it becomes available. It's just like sending loving kindness. You send it to the person that is most available and easiest for you. So then I look at the world and look at the news. It's so easy to have loving kindness for those who are suffering. And then immediately I drop to that place. And from that place, then I say, okay, so you did something very similar to what this person might have had done. And so that becomes possible. And I really am glad that you two men talked about caressing yourself, because if they say that's a woman thing, but that really helps. I actually started It is. It really
It
works.
works
because,
really well. For me, it
well,
works incredibly well.
energetically speaking, hands are the most healing. Touch is the most healing. So the combination of it, especially lovingly, I was doing it to a child. I would just say, nice, Mitra. That's exactly how I did it with my kids when they were like babies. Nice. And then I immediately settle down and come out that survival mode that I cannot be kind from. That space of surviving, it's let's run. You did something wrong. It's not acceptable. Look, correct it now. And then I drop into, it's okay. We're all work in progress. I hear you. I see you. Oh, whoops. I call it whoopsing. I whoops it a lot. Whoops. Did it again.
It would be irresponsible if I didn't bring in the connection between the mind and the heart in this practice that you mentioned, Mitra, and that Ben, you were talking about. So there's caress, which is some people do the havening technique, caressing the arms. And there's also caressing on the face, which has a different impact because of the nerves of the vagus nerve, which is the longest nerve in the body coming from the brain. And there are branches, especially around the ear. Ben, you said, why is it when I caress around my ear, I feel relaxed? So you are activating your vagus nerve on top of mothering yourself in that moment and releasing oxytocin. So now we not only have the chemicals of oxytocin, which is lowering your blood pressure, putting you more in a state of calm rather than survival, you're activating the strongest nerve for relaxation in the body, which is the vagus nerve, which further lowers your blood pressure and heart rate and puts you in a more receptive state.
Wow.
Incredible.
Isn't it wonderful to have a doctor, a scientist in the house?
Yeah, it's because it's no longer this esoteric concept. There's a scientific explanation for it as well, which I find is the case for anything.
I'm always afraid, though, that in another life, I was a magician. And I was afraid that if I ever would show someone how the trick was done, they wouldn't appreciate it anymore. And yet now it's my real firm belief that the more we understand the actual causes of our emotions and our thoughts and our behaviors, the more control we have, the more choice we have. So I think for me, I have to be careful in how I bring the science in because I lean heavily towards that. And it can sometimes get in the way of the more ethereal, spiritual, mystical experience.
Oh, I love that, Jonathan. Thank you for saying that. I used to teach at School of Neuroscience at UCLA. So I had a lot of scientists there. And I used to say, wisdom knows. And now, the past 200-300 years, science is showing. Wisdom knows, science shows. And you used to irk them because they just belong to the science world. Of course, it was absolutely no discounting or disregarding science. What it was like, when you jump up and down as a scientist, just know that you're just getting part of the wisdom. And as time goes on and as these researches and technologies become more advanced, then we will understand and have evidence for something that wisdom and old cultures knew for a long time. We're just finding evidence for it. It's like I tell you something and you say, oh, let me go and find out if I can bring any supporting documents.
It's different ways of knowing. And this is why the book itself, if I was going to spend 2 years researching something and doing 60 interviews, I wanted to have something that was going to be timeless. And so I held the concepts to a pretty high standard of, will these be relevant in 3,000 years? These 7 traits of the heart. And I figured that if they've been relevant for 3,000 years already, and now we have science supporting them, they'll probably be around for a while.
So, Jonathan, we've talked about things that we can do, but what about just creating space, doing less? In our world today, especially in America, there's a tendency to fill in all the open space. I got to be doing something. Even when it comes to my healing, I got to be doing something. I got to be meditating. I got to do some breath work. I got to caress myself.
Yeah.
But what about doing less and creating space? How has that played a part in your journey and in your philosophy about the heart?
Do you want the easy answer or the hard answer?
Let's start with the easy one, and then we'll work our way to the hard one.
The easy answer is that before I knew there was another way to exist, a way that involved slowing down and doing less, I didn't know. I didn't know there was another way to exist. I didn't know about rest other than at night you go to sleep, and if you're tired on the weekend, you take a nap. That was my knowledge of rest for 30 years of my life. And it's a shame because as a heart doctor, half of the heart's activity is rest. It's squeezing and resting and squeezing and resting. And yet we go through our lives for various reasons. And that's part of the hard part of the answer, the complicated part. Why do we do what we do? When I first discovered mindfulness practice, along with it came yoga, as I mentioned, and breath practices and deep relaxation practices and activating the body's relaxation response system, which is, there's a whole center at Harvard called the Herbert Benson Center, founded by a cardiologist 50 years ago. And he discovered that the same practices used in meditative traditions for thousands of years, mantras and breath practices and visualization practices, have specific medical benefits because they all do one thing in common. Not because they connect us with the divine, but because they relax the body's nervous system. And we are all desperate for that relaxation. And so it's really been important in my own life to remove a lot of the unnecessary stress that I was carrying day by day, letting go over and over each day. And it's part of how I help my patients heal their hearts. And I check and I listen. Are they giving themselves rest, mental rest, whether that's from the guilt, rest from the grief that so many people carry, physical rest? I would say that's the easy answer. The hard answer is, why are we driven? And I think there are internal forces that drive us because of our conditioning to constantly do. And there are external forces and messages that we're receiving all the time. And then there are practical reasons why we have to do. Many of us have to make money and pay their mortgage and put our kids through school. So there's this beautiful kind of balancing act between doing and non-doing. But the message for me is to remember how essential that non-doing, restful state is, not just for our mental well-being, but for our physical health.
So how does non-doing look for you in your life right now?
Yeah, so that was non-doing right there. Non-doing. There was a time when I would have felt pressure to answer the question right away, because this is a conversation and it's going to be published. People will be making up their minds about the answers and the questions. And there's this pressure to perform. And so for me, non-doing requires a letting go of worrying about what people are thinking of what I'm doing, whether I'm doing or not. So what it looks like for me is, in a sense, noticing how much I'm concerned about others' opinions and letting go of that. And because, and this is important, because the prevailing culture says that if you are not doing something, there's something wrong with you.
That's the big one right there. That's a huge one that a lot of people deal with.
Yeah. And to do that requires the courage to know what is natural, what is right, what is balanced, which is the body and the mind need rest. And every message we receive to the contrary is driving us towards sickness and exhaustion. And for me, what it looks like is, number one, recognizing when I'm only doing to perform and doing to achieve and doing for other people. I'm tired of that. I'm done with that. I've had enough. And then it's an active alarm bell to say, okay, time to sit still, or time to just walk back and forth with no intention, no direction, no destination, no planning, and carving out that time every day to allow my mind real rest.
And this is where I see curiosity is key, right? To be curious about doing less. What would happen if I create more space? And even this belief system that many deal with, which is, if I'm not productive, then there's something wrong with me. We don't have to discount it right away. We can approach it from a curious perspective. Is it true that if I do less, that there's something wrong with me? I'm curious about that. Let me experiment a little bit. And the example you gave, I think, is really beautiful because it's such an easy one, which is pausing before you answer. Even that little bit can teach us a lot. These little micro moments of creating space can teach us a lot. And we can experiment with it, and we can validate whether that hypothesis that if I'm doing less, that there's something wrong with me is true or not.
Yes. I was just thinking about how the role of what I call institutions in our lives has played this really strong role to give us this notion of doing more is better. And this wheel seems to be the new generation, and you have younger children, Jonathan, than I do, feel like they are waking up to that, even though I know social media, all of that is happening. But they are more relaxed from what I can see. I would love to hear your notion, like our generation. I'm much older than both of you, but my generation was like, go achieve, do this, do that. And then the next one took it to a higher level. They just wake up at 3 o'clock and go and get doing. I remember I used to go to my office before COVID, and in that building, there are a lot of other offices, mainly law offices and also other professional offices. No matter how early I went and parked my car, there were cars there. And I was thinking, what time do these people come to work? Every time I remember once I went at 5 a.m. because I had a celebrity client that couldn't come during the day. And I thought, good, there would be nobody there. And I go there, there are like about 20 cars there. And they're all warm and they look like they just parked their car. So I felt always that no matter what I do, I'm not doing enough because there are people who are doing, not being. And of course, the journey helps and all of that. But what I'm seeing, or at least maybe it's my hopeful and imaginative kind of future, that the new generation, really fresh generation, are saying, no, as they called it, I want to chill. I don't want to do these things that you're doing. They're not really appealing to me. What are your observations, Jonathan?
I'm thinking through the lens of my son who's in college and then my 16-year-old who's in high school. And then I'm also matching that up against with what I know about human psychology. Regardless of the era or the epoch we're talking about, regardless of whether social media is causing us to have this fear of keeping up with others, constant fear, the constant signaling by those we work with, by those we're colleagues with, that it seems like people never take a break. And by the way, when I'm resting, sometimes I'll post about it. Or if I'm taking a week off of social media for a reason, I post about it. I say, we need rest. We need, as we call in cardiology, diastole. Cool. But on the flip side, we humans need just a very few things. And one of them is to have a sense of achievement and accomplishment. Mm-hmm. And so there's this natural urge to dream, to want to create. We are creative beings. And so I think it's really a matter of not necessarily doing less, but in a sense, being more intentional about what we're doing and about the rest we take in between the notes of our lives. That's my initial reaction.
I love that. I distinguish it between, is my being dictating my doing, or my doing is dictating my doing?
Yes, that's awesome.
They're two different ways. Yeah, I love that. All right. So you're saying if we are more intentional, meaning our being is also being fed while we're doing, then maybe it is not the amount of hours that we work as it is about the quality of what we do. Am I hearing that correctly?
Yeah, it's exactly. The quality and the intentionality, I would say. We can become exhausted when we're pursuing so many things at once. I also have to call out, and I made reference a little bit before, that some of the answers to these questions and the challenges we face are generational. And you made reference to this too. So what's challenging for me in my early 50s is not the same as someone who's in their 20s, is not the same as someone in their 70s. And whether we're talking about the urge to accomplish or to leave a legacy or to constantly create. Arthur Brooks writes about how we have two forms of intelligence, one for the beginning of our lives and one for the second half of our lives. And I'm really fascinated by this idea of the transitions between the eras of our life and how it's so tempting to reach for one answer, but the answer to what is going to nourish us changes as our years go by.
Oh, I just love what you're talking about. I teach mindful aging, and that's exactly the theme for it. So we go from in a very generic and overly generalizing way. There is the body, there's the mind, there's the soul. And when we get stuck, and we see that, especially with aging these days, when we see as people age, they stay very focused on their look, that ends in suffering. Of course, I'm not talking about ignoring our look. That's the other extreme. But being obsessed about it, like a teenager might be, and how much attention I give to how I look and what I wear. And when that stays at the earlier and younger stage, there's a lot of suffering. What is fascinating to me, Jonathan and Ben, is that if a younger person gets more interested in, say, the spirituality aspect of their life, that feeds them. But the reverse doesn't work. When as older person, I'm in my 60s, late 60s, I'm 67. So if I get too obsessed with my earlier stage of life obsession, the look, or even the mind as far as achievement is concerned, not learning, then that ends up in suffering. But the other way around, it actually enriches the life of a youngster who is really deep and is interested in fascinating stuff of life.
Yeah, it makes sense. And it's something that was not part of my consciousness, because why would it be? When you're 17 years old, do you think you're going to live forever? And when you're 25 years old, you're making up, or at least I was making up rules in my mind about how life was. And I had rigid frameworks about how everyone should think, act, and feel. And now, as I've met enough people and I've lived enough, I realized that I should throw a lot of the rules in the garbage, that there's no one framework that we can all use. And it's a matter of, we all have a collection of inner resources. And what may be right for me at this stage in my life, I may need more courage. Someone else might need to experience more empathy, more warmth. And so I think I'm much more interested, as you're talking, about the way of being rather than the doing. And yet we also need the doing to get us into the being sometimes. So there's two ways in. We can begin with the being, or we can begin with the doing.
Yeah, I can see that.
Part of the being is also looking at the belief systems, the attachments that we have that are leading us to want to be, we were talking about being productive and whatnot, because that's ultimately the root of it, in my perception. We have these beliefs because we know how to be. We know how to be and be in a way that is happy, joyful, balanced, harmonious with life, pursuing the things that we're passionate about, cultivating relationships that are healthy and fulfilling. We know. We don't need anybody to show us, really. It's really all reminders. Everything that we're reading, the experts that we're hearing from, they're not teaching us something new. That there's a knowingness in us, and they're reminding us. So the question, for me always becomes, what is the thing that's blocking the knowingness? What is blocking my inherent understanding of how to be in a way that is balanced and happy and joyful, and looking at that?
It makes me think of, in Buddhism, that there are the 5 hindrances. So what you're talking about goes back thousands of years, looking at the obstacles. And by simply removing the obstacles, sometimes our essence emerges. So the hindrances are desire and aversion and restlessness and torpor or sleepiness and lack of self-trust or self-doubt. And I find it just amazing that some of these wisdom traditions had the answers there for us.
It's so simple,
what you're saying.
Right?
Yeah.
It's so simple, but we don't want to believe it's that simple.
Yeah.
It's simple, but also really difficult.
Yes.
It's really hard to face some of these fears, right? I'll give you a personal example. I, being a Persian Jewish background, there was a huge pressure to succeed, to not only be productive, but to succeed at a certain level. And I had sold my business, and I went through a period where I was feeling a huge pressure, internal pressure within me. Okay, I got to go to the next thing. I got to create the next successful thing. And the dialogue, I didn't even realize this at the time. The dialogue was really, or else my tribe will abandon me.
Yeah.
I was telling myself at that time that no, this is a natural desire that I have, and I'm not doing it because of my own faults. So that was creating additional pressure on me. So what I did, I had a choice. I could either abide to the social conditioning that I received, or I could choose to confront it and to actually consciously not pursue a career, not pursue, in the traditional sense, doing something that would fulfill those social expectations. And that is very scary. It is very scary. It brings up all sorts of stuff. And that takes courage. That takes courage, which you speak to a lot.
Yeah.
So, yeah, they seem so simple, right? These principles of removing the obstacles, and with tools and with perspectives like those that you teach, they can become easier.
Ben, I'm sorry you've struggled with that, and I can feel it. I was there. I tell the story. In my house, the way it played out was a little different. The expectations were clear growing up. There was one photograph on the wall that all 7 children would look at each day when we would go downstairs into the living room, and it was a larger-than-life picture of Albert Einstein. And so my parents were very clear about what the expectations were for all of us. And pressure to always be the one who knows is relentless. So I can hear you and I feel that. And there's a freedom in letting go of that.
Yeah,
of
and
that
the other
pressure
side of that, I didn't share the other side of that. The other side of that is, whoa, such liberation when we can face that thing.
Yeah.
And when we can look at it for what it is and realize that it's all an illusion, it's not real. The fear is not real. The liberation that's experienced, the opening of the heart that's experienced, the warmth that comes through. It's like, wow, that was worth it. I'm so happy I did that.
It's so liberating. And then it's also a very universal theme that I've come across and that I've experienced. There's a dichotomy, and I love dichotomies because they're all false, they're all artificial, they're all based on ideas in the mind, and yet they're helpful, and there's always something in between. And the dichotomy is between autonomy and authenticity to our true selves, whatever that means, because we weren't born in a vacuum. We were born to a mother and a family and environment. But yet we have this inner calling, our North Star, our core, whatever you want to call it. And there's this tension between that and this desire to fit in, to belong to our tribe, as you said, this need for intimacy with others. Gabor Mate has done such wonderful speaking and writing about this as well, but it's a real timeless tension that's there that there's no fixed point. It's one moment of our lives, it's rebellion against the tribe. And in another moment, it's this feeling of belonging and committing to the norms and standards of the tribe. This gets back into the aging process, right? Why do those who rebel tend to be younger? Why do we celebrate rebellion in the youth? And we don't find as many 80 and 90-year-olds who are out there with the science. And I think there are reasons for that.
Yeah, before we move on, I just wanted to acknowledge the intelligence of your parents, first of all.
What a great way of relaying a message. Okay, I know it was imprisoning and all of that, but come on, let's give it to them. That is the most intelligent
way of communicating information to 7 kids. You don't need to say it.
Yeah.
You just put a picture. That gave me an idea. You can just put a big picture of the ideal person. The standards are high in this place, and you better know it. And that's our standard. And have a great day.
Very simple, very clear message. No words.
I love that. Very intelligent. What would be one last thing that you would like to tell people who are listening to this conversation, this interview of the 3 of us, mainly you, and are living with a sense of anxiety? And as I'm sure Jonathan and Ben, it really doesn't matter what I'm anxious about. If it's a discoloration on my face, or it's about the state of the world and the future of the next generation, all of them feel the same in my body. What is your one thing that you would like to share as both the seeker and the teacher?
Thank you for that. I'm going to receive that. I'm going to write it down. Inner and outer healing. I love that. So I'm going to be a rebel again, and I'm not going to give you 1. I'm going to give you 2. I'm such a rebel.
Love that.
Yeah. So you use the word health, and what does it mean? People are anxious now. And when we're anxious, we're losing that sense of inner balance, that inner well-being that's essential for health. And so the first, really, it's just a piece of knowledge, which is, what does the word health mean? And it comes from the word whole. Whole and health mean the same thing. And the first is to remember that we may feel broken. We're taught to focus on our broken parts and our blemishes, and there's no shortage of criticism and people who are there to judge us from a very young age. And so the process is really simpler than we think, and it's to recognize that we're already whole. We already all have that beauty inside of us that maybe we were told was ugly. If we're fortunate, we can find friends and people who are there to hold space for us, to hold a mirror to our beautiful parts. That's what we need, to remember that health is not far away. And yes, if you break a bone, the bone is still broken, but it's more of a mindset. Am I a broken person? It's, again, the difference between guilt and shame. I can have broken parts, but I can still be whole. And this is talking about the mind, the body, and the spirit. And the second piece, you spoke about anxiety. And for me, there's only one way. There's only one way for someone who's really actually committed to ending their anxiety, committed to not being stuck in a perpetual state of suffering for the rest of their life until the next source of anxiety comes up. The only path has to be of relating to our thoughts in a different way. And it's detangling our identity from the thoughts that happen in our mind. I know of no other way to overcome anxiety than to find some separation, either learning to witness and watch our own thoughts in a more detached way, to welcome our thoughts, as we talked earlier in the conversation, as parts of ourself from internal family systems psychotherapy, to see that some of our thoughts are just the small child in us offering thoughts, rather than identifying with them. So I would say for anyone who's suffering from anxiety, are you willing? Are you interested? Are you curious about relating to the thoughts that are making you anxious in a new way? Because once you're really curious to let go of the anxiety, and that's really the biggest barrier, we become addicted to our own anxiety. It becomes a comfort blanket because we've known it for so long. We don't know what life could be like without it. We're afraid that it won't point us in the right direction. So those are my thoughts that come up with your question about health and about the anxiety that we're all potentially facing.
It hits chords for me because in my past, I've struggled a lot with anxiety. And I'm just going to add, be gentle with yourself.
Yeah.
Cultivate that. It's hard at first. It's a practice. And the easiest way to start is the physical touch exercise is great because you don't need mind for that. You don't need mind. Just touch yourself, caress yourself in a loving way. Yeah. Jonathan, this has been such a joy. Thank you. Thank you for sharing your light, your wisdom with us.
It was a pleasure. But I want you to just say a little bit about your book before we go away.
A little bit about my book. It's 25 years in the making. It's the book that I wish I learned when I was dealing with anxiety and depression. It's got all of the practices. I interviewed more than 25 mental health experts in addition to mind-body experts and spiritual leaders. It is a fusion of traditional Western science and Eastern holistic wisdom traditions. I did a fair amount of research with reading 1,000 citations, modern research showing that our thoughts and our feelings and our social connections have a direct impact on what's happening in our hearts. And there is a lot of choice we have about how we can heal ourselves from within and connect more with others. And it's called Just One Heart, a cardiologist's guide to healing, health, and happiness. And you can find it on Amazon.
It's a very highly rated book for everybody listening. It's got 4.8 on Amazon and a 4.8 on Goodreads as well. The readers have been very receptive and are enjoying what you have to share. We'll include a link in our show notes for all the listeners.
Yes,
Thank you.
that would be
Thank
wonderful.
you both. You all are awesome. I'm excited for your podcast. I can't wait to listen to all of the episodes. And the two of you have such a warm and welcoming energy and a wisdom, and good luck with everything.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for tuning in today. For a list of the links and other resources referenced in this episode, check out the podcast description.
If you're benefiting from our podcast, we'd love if you could help us reach more people by subscribing. Your support means the world to us. From our hearts to yours, we thank you.